Imagine the weight of 1,000 years pressing softly against the golden grass of the American heartland. Long before the skyscrapers touched the clouds or the highways carved their paths across the continent, there was a silence so profound it felt like a living thing. This isn't just a story of dates and wars, it's a journey into the soul of the land itself, a rhythmic, breathing history that hums a lullaby to those willing to listen. The sun begins its slow amber descent over the rolling hills of the Great Plains, casting shadows that stretch like ancient memories across the tall grass prairie. If you were standing there centuries ago, the only sound you would hear would be the rhythmic sigh of the wind, a wind that has traveled thousands of miles, carrying the scent of wild sage and damp earth. This is the beginning of the story of a land that would eventually become the United States, but in this moment, it is a vast, untouched canvas of green and gold. The history of this land is written in the layers of the soil and the flow of the rivers. Think of the Mississippi River, a winding silver ribbon that pulses like the great artery of the continent. For thousands of years, civilizations rose and fell along its banks. The Mississippian culture, with their great earthen mounds like Cahokia, built cities that rivaled the size of ancient Rome. As you visualize these mounds, massive grassy pyramids rising from the flat earth, imagine the people who lived there. They weren't just figures in a textbook, they were dreamers, builders, and observers of the stars. They watched the same moon you see tonight, tracking its phases with a precision that speaks of a deep, quiet wisdom. The air in these ancient settlements was filled with the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn. Life moved at the pace of the seasons. There was no rush, no ticking of a mechanical clock. Instead, there was the migration of the bison, a thunderous heartbeat that moved across the plains in millions. Close your eyes and imagine that sound, a low, distant rumble that vibrates through the soles of your feet, like a heavy blanket being shaken out over the earth. The bison were the lifeblood of the plains, and their presence was a constant grounding force. As the centuries drifted by, like clouds passing over a summer field, the eastern shores began to see new arrivals. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and temperamental, brought ships with tall white sails that looked like ghost birds against the horizon. When the first settlers stepped onto the rocky shores of New England or the marshy banks of Virginia, they encountered a world that was both terrifying and breathtakingly beautiful. The forests were so thick that a squirrel could supposedly travel from the Atlantic to the Mississippi without ever touching the ground. Imagine the canopy of those trees, ancient oaks, towering pines, and sturdy maples, creating a cathedral of green light that filtered down to a soft floor of moss and fallen leaves. In the early colonies, like Jamestown and Plymouth, the nights were incredibly dark. Without the glow of electricity, the stars were brilliant diamonds scattered across a velvet sky. The settlers would sit by their hearths, the crackle of the fire being the only sound in the wilderness. They brought with them traditions from across the sea, but the land began to change them. They learned the secrets of the soil from the indigenous peoples, how to plant beans, corn, and squash together in a three sisters harmony that nourished the earth as much as the people. This was a time of slow growth, of roots digging deep into new ground. As we move through the 1700s, the atmosphere of the colonies begins to shift, but the pace remains deliberate. In the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia and Boston, the air is thick with the scent of salt air and ink. The thinkers of the time, men like Benjamin Franklin, spent hours in quiet contemplation, watching the lightning or the way a candle flame flickers in a draft. There was a profound respect for the power of ideas. They weren't just building a government, they were articulating a dream. The American Revolution is often told as a story of loud battles and shouting, but at its heart, It was a quiet determination. Imagine the winter at Valley Forge. The world is hushed under a heavy layer of snow. The only sound is the crunch of boots on ice and the low murmur of men huddled around small fires. The silence of that winter was where the character of a nation was forged. It was a time of waiting, of breathing through the cold, and of holding on to a vision of a future that hadn't yet arrived. After the dust of the war settled, the new nation looked westward. The horizon was an endless invitation. Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark into the unknown, not to conquer, but to observe. Imagine their journey, paddling up the Missouri River, the water swirling softly against the wood of their canoes. They saw landscapes that no European eyes had ever witnessed, the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies rising like white teeth against a blue sky, and the vastness of the Columbia River Gorge, where the mist clings to the cliffs like a soft gray veil. They moved slowly, documenting every bird, every plant, and every bend in the river. It was a trek of discovery that required a calm, steady mind. The 1800s brought the era of the pioneer. The covered wagons, known as prairie schooners, moved across the landscape like slow-moving ships on a sea of grass. The rhythm of the journey was set by the walking pace of the oxen, step after step, mile after mile. The families inside the wagons watched the landscape change from the lush forests of the east to the open expanses of the west. At night, they would circle the wagons and sit under the vast dome of the sky. The fire cramp would die down to glowing embers, and the only sound would be the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance, a lonely, musical sound that reminded them of how small they were in this magnificent, sleeping continent. The history of the United States is a tapestry of these quiet moments. It is the sound of the axe in the woods, the creak of a rocking chair on a porch in the South, and the steady hum of a blacksmith's bellows. It is the story of people who understood that anything worth building takes time. They lived in harmony with the rising and setting of the sun. Even as the Industrial Revolution began to introduce the sound of steam engines and clanging metal, the vast majority of the country remained a place of rural peace. Think of the small towns that began to dot the landscape. A single main street, a general store where the floorboards creaked underfoot, and a church bell that marked the passing of the hours. Life was tactile. You felt the grain of the wood, the coolness of the well water, and the warmth of a wool blanket. This was the era of the great American frontier, but for those living it, it was simply home. It was a place where the horizon was always calling, but the hearth was where the heart rested. As we close this first part of our journey, imagine yourself sitting on a porch in a small Midwestern town in the mid-1800s. The fireflies are beginning to wink in the tall grass, the air is cooling, and the sounds of the day are fading into the gentle chorus of crickets. The history of this land is not just in the books, it is in the very air you breathe. It is a legacy of resilience, of beauty, and of a quiet strength that has endured through the ages. Rest now, knowing that the earth beneath you has seen it all and continues to turn, slowly and steadily, under the watchful eyes of the stars. The story of America is just beginning to unfold like a flower opening in the moonlight. We have seen the ancient mounds, the early colonies, and the first steps into the wilderness, but there is so much more to feel, so much more to hear in the whispers of the past. For now, let the silence of the Great Plains wrap around you like a soft, familiar cloak. The journey continues, but for this moment, all is still, all is peaceful, and the history of the land is a song of rest.